Hi, I'm Breanne Deppisch, and I'm an energy reporter for the Washington Examiner. I'm joined here by my plugged-in podcast co-host, Neil Chatterjee, and we're here for a very special edition, marking 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're here to break down what this means in terms of renewable energies, in terms of the oil and gas markets. Really, it's been a war that has upended nearly every aspect of the energy sector. Neil, how about you kick us off?
Yeah, look, the implications of Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine have been significant in the energy space. They've obviously had critical geopolitical implications, but it's really upended domestic energy policy and politics here in the U.S. as well. It's complicated things, questions around what the role of U.S. natural gas will be domestically and as an export. What we should do about the energy transition and the pace of the transition and the deployment of renewables. What our relationships will be with Europe, our allies there, with Russia, with China. Just so much has been turned upside down in the past year. There's a lot to unpack.
We've seen Russia weaponize basically every tool in its toolbox when it comes to energy. We saw them, beginning over the summer, just throttling their gas supplies to Europe, beginning to deliver on their threats to cut off gas supplies, which they obviously then shut off entirely. Then there were the Nord Stream blasts, making any future deliveries via Nord Stream impossible. Then beyond that, we saw the West taking some actions of its own. As we all know, the EU moved to ban all imports of Russian crude oil imports. That took effect in December. And then they banned refined petroleum goods, and that took effect in February. Basically, in order to kind of offset some of this immediate damage to global oil markets, G7 countries, as well as kind of a broader coalition, including Australia, the UK, some others, basically kind of banded together and they passed this price cap. This was an effort to ensure that they could keep Russian barrels on the market while also while encouraging them to produce. They agreed to set a cap that was slightly above the cost of production, but that one that would really cut into Putin's war chest.
So that was the goal, right? Like, we still need Russian oil, but Putin is using the revenues from that oil to finance his war. This is a way we could continue production without benefiting Putin, or at least minimizing his ability to leverage those revenues.
Absolutely, because there was real fear that if the EU moved forward just unilaterally with these bans on these imports, they made up by and large almost entirely of Russia's customer base. So there were fears that if Russia couldn't have access to the EU's shipping services and could no longer send their oil and send their petroleum products to Europe, there was real fear that they would just stop production. Moscow does not have good oil storage facilities, meaning that they would basically just have to flare their supplies. They would have to stop production or get rid of them. So this was designed to keep barrels on the market while also cutting into Putin's war chest. Whether or not that has had its intended effect, I think, remains to be seen. And that's in part because, and you and I were talking about this earlier, that's in part because of the large, really actually historic amount of ghost tankers or shadow fleet, that's unregistered kind of crude tankers that Russia has amassed, even prior to this G7 price cap taking effect. These were ships that have long been used by Iran, by Venezuela, to sort of circumvent sanctions and continue to ship their supplies on the global market.
So that begs the question, as the West looks towards sanctions as the counterbalance to Russia, are these sanctions working? Are we hurting ourselves, but Russia is still getting support from elsewhere, and therefore all we're doing is creating domestic damage with no real impact to inhibiting Putin's ambitions?
That's a great question. And I think, honestly, As both of these, both parts of the price cap have really come into force, we've seen sort of more of an acknowledgement from Treasury officials and other Western leaders that, I think when it came to the lesser of two evils, which was, either causing Russia to halt production, just totally upending global supplies, taking all of their oil off the market, which would be devastating, or allowing them to keep their oil on the market and, ultimately pay for this secret regime of unregistered tankers. Obviously they're going to accrue a little bit of higher costs if they're sending them themselves. They are going to choose that option, right? They would rather Russia be sending its barrels illegally or kind of around this sanctions regime. And I think actually Wally Adeyemo acknowledged as much in recent days. He said, what, ultimately they are forced to pony up a higher price than they would be if they used Western shipping services. The only problem is from an evaluation standpoint, it really does make it difficult to know how much revenue Russia's getting from their Urals grade crude, which is their primary export.
That's just because we can't track it.
We can't track it. We have no data. I've talked to some analysts. I've asked, well, is it higher or lower than current estimates, which show it's, around $40 or, somewhere in that range in recent days. And they said, we have no idea. There is just way too many tankers on the market. It's unclear if they are going to be able to do that with refined petroleum products because the potential buyers are a little bit more limited, but we can go into that in a second.
It's wild. It's just caused, as we reflect a year in, how much energy really undergirded this war. I've talked on the Plugged In podcast before, my belief that I really think it was Putin's energy dominance over Western Europe in particular that emboldened him to invade Ukraine. Even though Putin gets the bulk of his revenues from oil and natural gas is a much smaller percentage, because Europe is so dependent on that Russian gas, I think he was banking on the West and on Europe in particular crumbling because they need that Russian gas so badly. Now, a couple of things have happened that are really interesting that have broader implications. One, Europe had a mild winter.
Insanely mild winter.
And that was that was incredibly fortuitous, as that some of the worst concerns about Europeans potentially freezing were avoided because of that good fortune. Some of the storage, had been filled with Russian gas, so they had reserves. But one understated part of this is that shipments of LNG that were slated to go to Asia were redirected to the European market. Now,
at a faster pace than they thought they were going to be.
At a faster pace. And the one result of that is, yes, it enabled Europe to get through this winter without the worst fears and consequences being realized. But what that meant was these Asian countries, oftentimes poorer Asian countries, were denied the LNG that they needed. They had to resort to burning more coal, or in some instances, resorting to blackouts and brownouts. And so there are implications there around energy poverty, around the climate implications of these countries replacing cleaner LNG with dirtier sources of fuel. Just one more example of how all of the counter moves to Putin's moves have really upended conversations around climate change, energy efficiency, and the energy transition.
Yeah, it's really, and I'm glad you made that point because it is tempting, and I think the media often takes the lens, when they're viewing these ramifications of the war, they often just view it through the lens of Western countries and how's Europe doing, how's the U.S. doing. But I think it's really important, to be thinking about these other things, to be thinking about what countries have been forced to turn to really dirty sources of energy production. That is definitely a major point that we could not overstate. And one other thing I wanted to talk about is, storage stands at about 60% right now in Europe. That is way, way beyond, I think, analysts' wildest hopes and dreams prior to the start of winter, right? They were fearful that, I think they thought they were going to hit 60% storage mark, even before Christmas or before the new year. And they thought, a lot of scenarios and modeling showed them, depleting most of their gas storage before the end of the winter season, and that's actually happening in a couple of weeks. And so 60%, and as we're entering into March, is a pretty good number. That actually puts them in a better position to refill their reserves ahead of the 2023-2024 winter season, which I think is what IEA officials and other European Commission officials were really worried about. Because like you said, this past winter, they had the ability to use the Russian supplies and really, kind of fill up their coffers. This upcoming winter, they're just going to be starting from zero.
And there's no guarantee that they're going to have the luck with the weather that they had. And quite frankly, I mean, Putin could take more aggressive actions to further, cut off production and supplies.
Exactly. There's a lot of, there are a lot of measures that I think there's a lot of potential, I think, sort of retaliatory things he could still do that he hasn't yet.
We're here at year 1 after the war. If we're still here at year 2, things could look pretty ugly.
Yeah, and clearly Putin is not a man who's known for standing down, and he's shown that he's willing to do whatever it takes. So one thing I think we would be remiss not to touch on is just how much I think the war and the resulting energy crisis has forced the U.S. for sure, and then also countries in Europe and around the world to really reevaluate their own relationship to energy and supply security, right? I think, quite honestly, or at least what I've been told from my sources on the Hill, is that this was a big part of leaders' thinking in passing the Inflation Reduction Act in August. It was this acknowledgement that we do need this sort of EV market, we do need these critical minerals, and we need that supply chain at home, which we have not had in the past. I think they saw Europe as a cautionary tale. Its dependence on Russia, really left them high and dry. So we're not trying to imitate that by any means.
Yeah, look, I think you saw sort of a split approach amongst people's viewpoints in how to deal with the implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On the one hand, I think, saw a recognition that we need gas in particular, that natural gas, LNG, is so critical to energy security, to geopolitical security, that, some of the sort of momentum against gas in the U.S. was halted and started to reverse course a little bit, and we recognize the importance of gas. You also had this sort of focus on accelerating the deployment of renewables, a sense that, okay, Russia was empowered to do this because of reliance on fossil fuels and their usage of fossil fuels in the geopolitical arena. If we can move towards domesticating, using domestic renewables, that will weaken petro regimes like Russia in the future from taking these kinds of actions. So in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, massive investment, almost $370 billion in advancing the renewable energy future, with a significant investment in bringing the supply chain home. Because I also think what the war did was we have sort of taken our eyes off of reliability and energy security in our focus on decarbonization over the last couple of years. And I think that, this notion of energy security, of being dependent on someone else for your fuel, for your electricity, I think that caused a lot of folks to have a reawakening that we don't want to find ourselves in this position, and that if we transition away from domestic fossil fuels too quickly and we have this net zero future, this 100% clean energy future, but suddenly we are now dependent on adversarial countries like China for the critical minerals and the supply chain to drive that clean energy future, then suddenly we're dependent on China for our electricity. We find ourselves in an equally energy secure vulnerability place as our European allies did with Russian gas. And so I think, policymakers in the U.S. have really tried to wrestle with that, and we're now starting to see greater conversations around reliability, around making sure we have the necessary infrastructure in place to have a domestic gas market and potentially be able to export it to our allies. And then finding ways. We've got to build transmission to get clean energy onto the grid in the U.S. We've got to bring the supply chain for clean energy home so that we're not reliant on others, and this increased focus on electric reliability. A lot of this was in motion prior to the war because I think the energy transition was driving some of this, but there is no doubt about it that the war has, really stirred up this pot, if you will.
it's brought it to the fore of the political conversation in a way that I don't think it was before. Or at least it didn't have quite the momentum and sort of bipartisanship around it in a way that's been at least surprising for me, to cover the last year.
Yeah, look, we're here in Washington, D.C., and, you can't even agree what day of the week it is. Where there does seem to be some, bipartisan comity is around China and around the idea that we need to reevaluate our relationship with China. Where it gets complicated on the energy front is, you have some folks who are, coalescing around this idea of punishing Chinese emissions, leveraging America's carbon advantage and pushing for a border carbon adjustment mechanism to hit the Chinese for their emissions. You have others who are saying, yes, China is a problem. Reliance on China is a problem. We don't want to rely upon, slave labor. We don't want to empower the Chinese over our supply chain. But we can't overplay our hand because we need China if we're going to meet our decarbonization goals. And that's really creating some interesting moral questions, like what do you prioritize, your climate goals or your human rights goals?
This shift to renewables is not something that can happen overnight. We've saw Biden state, I think, 3 or 4 times since the State of the Union alone, that the transition to renewables will not happen just in the blink of an eye. We're going to need, I think he said on all those occasions, it's going to be at least 10 years. We are going to need fossil fuels as we...
Interesting question on that. And I love your interpretation because I've had this argument with a number of people. When Biden said we're going to need fossil fuels for 10 years, did he say at least 10 years or 10 years? Because my question is, who is he signaling to with that comment? Is he signaling to his progressive base that 10 years is it? Or is he signaling towards others that, no, we're going to need fossil fuels for the foreseeable future?
I read it since his first remark alluding to that was during the State of the Union. I actually interpreted it as his kind of opening salvo appealing to the wider electorate for 2024. That was how I saw it.
I've had some say, well, no, he's saying only 10 years.
It's interesting to me that he used
it's a Rorschach test.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say that taken in tandem with the rest of his speech, which seemed to be outlining his priorities for his next presidential run. That's what I took it as, at least. Certainly, lots to be determined in the next coming months. One big test will also be for Russia as it looks to sort of find new homes for its refined petroleum products. This is obviously not just Urals grade crude. Because there's not the same demand in Asia and India that there is for their crude, right? They obviously have a ton of their own refineries. They don't really need these, more expensive Russian products, and there's not really a need for them to import them at those higher price points. So whether or not Russia can keep those barrels on the market, that was a huge source of revenue that came directly from the European Union. And actually, whether the European Union, by extension, can find alternate sources of refined supplies and diesel and all those other refined products remains to be seen. I think that's one of the big known unknowns that we're going to see in the next couple months. What about you? Do you have any predictions?
It's all about transmission in the U.S. We've got to figure out how to get transmission built in this country if we want to get clean energy onto the grid. But the reality is it's difficult to get anything built in this country. Talk to anyone who's tried to build a natural gas pipeline, and they'll tell you there are legal obstacles and local opposition and so many challenges in the permitting process. Those same obstacles are going to apply to transmission. And so I think either my former colleagues at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or Congress, we're going to have to find a way to work through these myriad obstacles to getting transmission built, or else I've seen some studies that said almost 80% of the projected emissions reductions that are expected to emanate from the Inflation Reduction Act won't be realized if we don't triple the pace at which we build transmission in this country. A huge undertaking that I think we're going to be talking about, those of us in the energy space, for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic prediction. Certainly lots to watch in the year ahead. Thank you so much, Neil.
Always enjoy being with you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this special video edition of Plugged In. Again, I'm Breanne Deppisch, and you can follow my energy reporting as well as the reporting of the rest of my colleagues at the Washington Examiner.